The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, cream-colored and heavy, the kind of envelope that carries news nobody asked for. My father's assistant placed it on the kitchen counter before I'd even had my coffee. No explanation, just the envelope, and the way her eyes slid away from mine like she already knew what was inside and didn't want to be standing near me when I opened it. I was 26 years old. I ran a mid-sized nonprofit that worked in education access. I had an apartment downtown, a small terrace with a dead succulent I kept forgetting to replace, and a life that, while not glamorous, was entirely mine. That morning, I still believed those things would remain uncomplicated. The letter was from my father's legal team. It informed me, with the kind of polished formality that lawyers use to make terrible things sound inevitable, that there had been credible threats against members of my father's family. My father himself already had security. My older brother already had security. I, the second son, the one who ran a nonprofit and apparently represented a softer target, had not yet been assigned protection. That oversight, the letter said, was now being corrected. I was given no choice. I was given a name. Luke Leach would arrive Friday at 9 in the morning. He would serve as my personal security detail for the foreseeable future. I was to make accommodations. I called my father. The call went to voicemail, which was not unusual. My father and I communicated primarily through other people. I left a message that was more composed than I felt. Something like, "I received the letter. I'd appreciate a conversation." Then I put my phone face down on the counter and stared at my coffee until it went cold. By Thursday night, I had done everything I could to prepare. I'd cleared out the guest room. I'd bought an extra set of towels. I'd rearranged the front closet so there was space for gear or equipment or whatever a bodyguard brought with them. I'd also, embarrassingly, looked up the name Luke Leach online and found almost nothing. A LinkedIn profile with a deliberately sparse description. Former military. Private security. No photo. I told myself the blankness of that profile was professional, not ominous. I slept badly. I dreamed about storms, about the way the sky looks just before weather arrives. Gray and heavy and absolutely certain of itself. Friday morning, 9 o'clock precisely, someone knocked on my door. I opened it. The first thing I noticed was his size. Not height alone, though he was tall, well over 6 feet, but the particular quality of space he occupied. Some people fill a doorway with their presence. Luke Leach filled the entire visible world. He was broad-shouldered, with the kind of body that comes from years of functional use rather than aesthetic cultivation. Dark hair, cut close. A jaw that looked like it had opinions. Eyes the color of deep water, the kind of blue that is almost gray. And he was looking at me with an expression so carefully neutral, it might as well have been carved. He was wearing dark trousers and a plain dark jacket. No tie. He carried a single large duffel bag, and he held it as if it weighed nothing. "Mr. Barry," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not rise. "Luke Leach, I'm your assigned protection." I stepped back to let him in and managed, with what I consider an impressive amount of self-control, not to say anything foolish. He moved through my apartment with the quiet efficiency of a man assessing a space he would need to know by heart. It wasn't intrusive. It was methodical. He looked at the windows, the entry points, the layout. He asked me 2 questions, whether anyone other than myself had a key, and whether my schedule was consistent or variable. I told him my downstairs neighbor had a spare key, and that my schedule was mostly consistent but had irregular evening events for work. He nodded, as if filing both answers in a place where they would never be misplaced. Then he asked to see the guest room. I showed him. It was not a large room. It had a bed, a narrow wardrobe, and a window that looked out onto the side alley. I put the extra towels on the footboard, folded in that slightly too neat way you fold towels when you want someone to know you made an effort. Luke looked at the room for a moment, then looked at me. "This works," he said. And that was how Luke Leach arrived in my life, not like a guest, not like staff, like weather. Certain of itself, requiring no announcement, simply there. That first night I lay awake listening to the sounds of another person in my apartment. It was not an unpleasant sound. There was almost no sound at all, which was itself notable. I was accustomed to being the only person in my space, to knowing that every creak and shift was my own. Now there was someone else, and yet the apartment was almost quieter for his presence. He moved without noise. When the light under his door finally went out, sometime well past midnight, the darkness felt inhabited in a way that I was not prepared for. I told myself this awareness was entirely reasonable. There was a stranger in my home. Of course I was alert to him. I did not ask myself why alert had a warmth to it that stranger did not typically produce. In the morning when I found the coffee already made and poured my cup in silence and looked out the window at the city waking up, he was behind me at the kitchen table looking at his phone with the focused patience of someone reading a report. He was dressed already, dark and clean, as if he had never been anything other than ready. I said good morning. He said good morning. We drank our coffee. It was, for something that was entirely new, remarkably easy. The first week was an exercise in learning the geometry of someone else's presence. Luke was quiet in the way that large, capable things are quiet, the way a mountain is quiet. Not absence, but a kind of weight. He moved through my apartment without making the floorboards complain, which was something my last partner could never manage, and he had a way of being in a room that did not demand acknowledgement. He woke before I did, every day. By the time I came out of my bedroom in the morning, coffee was made. Not offered, exactly. Just there, in the pot, ready. He never made a production of it. He accompanied me everywhere. To work where he sat in the small reception area outside my office and read, though I noticed he was always aware of who came and went through the glass doors, his eyes tracking movement with the practiced ease of someone for whom alertness was not effort but habit. To the grocery store, where he pushed the cart without being asked, and somehow managed to do this in a way that didn't feel like servitude or condescension, but simply like a man who had noticed the cart needed pushing. To my running route along the river, where he ran 3 steps behind me without complaint, matching my pace exactly, which meant he was running considerably below his capacity. Because I am a moderate runner, and he was clearly not a moderate anything. In the second week, I tried to have a conversation. We were eating dinner. I'd cooked, which I always did on weekdays, and I'd made enough for 2 because making enough for 1 felt performatively lonely now that there were 2 people in the apartment. Luke ate everything on his plate with the attentiveness of someone who respected food, and when he was done, he sat with his hands resting on the table in that way of his. Completely still, present, without imposing. "What did you do before this?" I asked. A pause. Not reluctance exactly, more like the pause of someone who has learned to consider words before spending them. "Military for 8 years, he said. "Security contracting for 4. "Do you like it?" "The work." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'm good at it." That was not the same thing as liking it, and I noticed he hadn't answered the actual question. I also noticed he noticed that I'd noticed. "Fair enough," I said, and let it go. Later, washing dishes, I was aware of him clearing the table behind me without being asked, moving with that same quiet precision. And I thought about the fact that he had dodged my question so gracefully it had barely felt like a dodge at all. By the end of the second week, I understood the basic architecture of his silence. It was not coldness. It was containment. There was a great deal going on inside Luke Leach, but he kept it behind walls so practiced they might have been built in childhood. He was not unfriendly. When I talked, he listened with his whole attention, the kind of listening that made you feel your words were being taken seriously. He answered questions directly and without evasion when the questions were factual. He had a dry, understated humor that emerged occasionally in the form of a single, perfectly timed flat observation that made me laugh before I'd expected to. Once, at the grocery store, I spent 6 minutes debating between 2 very similar brands of pasta sauce. When I finally put one in the cart and turned around, he said very quietly, "I'm glad that's resolved," and walked forward. I laughed for half an aisle. He didn't smile, but something in his expression shifted, briefly, like light passing behind glass. The threats that had triggered all of this turned out to be serious enough that they weren't dismissed, but not so active that my daily life felt under immediate siege. Luke explained this to me in week 3, when I asked directly. There were credible indicators of intent. The security protocol was precautionary but not emergency level. The situation would be reassessed quarterly. What this meant in practice was that my life continued mostly normally, except that it contained Luke. He was not, as I had initially feared, oppressive company. He didn't hover. He didn't require entertainment. He had his own small routines. He read a great deal, serious nonfiction and the occasional novel that he kept the covers of turned down, as if he didn't want to be asked about them. He exercised every morning before I woke, returning from it with the particular quiet energy of someone who has already spent themselves on something physical and is now steady. He went to bed late, and I knew this because sometimes when I got up for water in the night, there was still a thin line of light under his door. I started, without planning to, paying attention to things about him that had nothing to do with security. The way he held a coffee cup, with his whole hand rather than just the handle, like he wanted the warmth. The way he read, very still, but with a quality of absorption that made the room feel quieter. The way he sometimes paused in the middle of a task and looked at nothing for a moment, somewhere internal, before returning. The way, when he was tired, a very slight line appeared between his brows that he seemed entirely unaware of. I noticed that he cut fruit with the care of someone who took small things seriously. That when my phone rang during dinner and I excused myself, he didn't pretend not to hear my half of the conversation, but also didn't react to it, maintaining a privacy for me that I hadn't asked for but appreciated. That he remembered, without being told twice, that I didn't eat cilantro and that I preferred the windows open when it rained. None of this was romantic. I was clear with myself about that. He was professional. He was here because my father's lawyers had sent him. He was doing his job. And yet, there are things that bodies know before minds catch up with them. I began to notice that I was aware of where he was in a room. The same way you are aware of a fire, not anxiously but constantly. That his voice had become something I oriented toward without meaning to. That when he was not present, not in the next room but actually gone, running an errand or checking in with his handlers, the apartment felt different, not lonely exactly, but less inhabited. One evening, coming home late from a fundraiser I'd attended for work, I was tired and a little undone, the kind of tired that sits behind the eyes. Luke had driven me and we were in the elevator and I was looking at my phone pretending to read emails, and he was standing beside me in his usual way and I became abruptly, acutely aware that I had not touched another human being in 3 months, not romantically. Just touched. A hand on a shoulder, an embrace, contact that carried warmth. My life before the arrangement had been social enough. After, it had narrowed. The people in it now were co-workers I saw at a professional distance, acquaintances I couldn't see as freely, and Luke, who was professional, who was here because he'd been sent. The elevator doors opened. I walked to my front door. Luke unlocked it because I was still looking at my phone and held the door, and I said thank you without looking up. And he said nothing. And I went inside and stood in my kitchen for a long time staring at the window. I was not, I told myself firmly, developing feelings for my bodyguard. The firmness with which I told myself this was not encouraging. It was a work event. One of the nonprofits we partnered with was holding a fundraising gallery show, and attendance was important. I wore a dark blazer over a white shirt, and I was looking at myself in the bathroom mirror longer than necessary when Luke appeared in the doorway behind me. He looked at me, and then looked away with the particular focus of someone who is being deliberately careful about where they look. "Ready," he said. The gallery was warm and crowded. Luke stayed at a distance that was close enough to matter and far enough to give me room to work the event. I networked. I smiled at the right people, said the right things, made the promises that could be kept. I was good at this part of my work, and I knew it. The performance of professional warmth, the architecture of making people feel seen. At one point, I glanced across the room and found Luke watching me, not scanning the room. Watching me specifically, with an expression I didn't have a word for, something quiet and intent. And then his eyes moved on without changing, as smooth as turning a page. An hour into the event, a man I vaguely knew from the social sector, handsome and easy in the way of men who had always been found attractive, positioned himself beside me at the drink table and began a conversation that was ostensibly about the work, but had a texture to it that was about something else. I was aware, peripherally, that Luke had moved closer. The man, whose name was Daniel, touched my arm at one point during a story he was telling. Not aggressively, casually, the way people touch when they're trying to signal that the conversation could become something. I smiled. I was polite. I also noticed, with a disproportionate sense of interest, that Luke had moved closer still, until he was just off my shoulder, present in a way that was professionally explainable and somehow also wasn't. Daniel made a joke. I laughed and turned to share the laugh with the room in the way of social reflex, and my eyes found Luke's. His expression was composed, completely professional, but there was something in the set of his jaw that I had not seen before. A tension, very slight, like a string pulled to a frequency it didn't usually carry. Daniel invited me for a drink after. I declined pleasantly, citing an early morning. Daniel took this well and moved on. In the car going home, I sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the city going past, and after a few minutes of silence I said, "You moved closer." Luke was quiet for a beat. "I noticed a change in the interactions dynamic," he said. "Appropriate to adjust positioning." "Right," I said. He said nothing. The city lights moved across the windshield. I turned to look at his profile in the dark, the clean line of his jaw, the way his hands sat on the wheel. And I thought about the string tension in his jaw at the gallery, and I turned back to the window and said nothing more. But I thought about it for a long time after I went to bed. Month 2. The grammar of our cohabitation had settled into something I recognized as its own language. Luke made coffee every morning. I cooked dinner most evenings. These were not agreements we had reached through discussion. They were arrangements that had emerged naturally, each of us taking up space the other left. On Sundays I went to the farmer's market and he came with me, and he carried the bag, and we moved through the stalls without talking much, and it was comfortable in the way only familiar things are. He had learned my schedule better than I knew it myself. He tracked things I mentioned in passing. When I said once, offhand, that I'd been having headaches from screen time, he adjusted the angle of my desk lamp while I was in a meeting and said nothing about it. When I mentioned I'd been sleeping poorly, I woke the next morning to find he'd switched out the blinds in my room for blackout curtains, also without comment. These were his jobs, I told myself. Comfort of the principal, environmental assessment, threat reduction, even threats of a minor domestic kind. Then why, I asked myself, did every single one of these small acts feel like something else? I started watching how he was with himself. Not with me, but with himself, when he thought no one was paying attention. He was, privately, a person of small and quiet habits. He kept his space immaculate, not out of military compulsion, I sensed, but out of a personal preference for order, a preference that was actually a kind of care for the environment he lived in. He made his bed every morning with the same attention he gave everything, not performance, just practice. He had a small collection of objects on his nightstand. I could see them through the open door when he left it ajar. A watch he never wore but kept there, a paperback with a broken spine, a smooth, dark stone that looked like it had come from water somewhere. I wanted to ask about the stone. I didn't. He had small kindnesses that seemed to embarrass him when I noticed them. The first time I caught him moving a fragile thing I'd left near the edge of a counter to somewhere safer, and I said, "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged with a particular compactness that meant the subject was closed. He had a habit, when I was upset, of not asking what was wrong. Instead, he would place himself nearby and become very quiet, and the quality of his silence would shift to something that felt less like absence and more like company, the kind of company that does not require performance from you. I'd had friends for years who couldn't do that. Luke did it without apparent effort or awareness. The night I got the call that the lead grant we'd been working on for 8 months had fallen through, I sat on the couch and stared at the wall, and Luke came and sat in the armchair across from me and didn't say a word, and stayed there until I was ready to talk. And when I was ready, he listened with his whole attention. And then he said, very quietly, "That's a significant loss. I'm sorry. Not a solution, not a reframe, just acknowledgement." I had to look at the wall again for a different reason. The thing about Luke Leach was that he was, underneath the control and the competence and the careful professional distance, an enormously gentle person, not soft. There was nothing soft about him, but gentle in the way strong things can be gentle. The way hands that could cause damage can choose instead to cup something fragile and hold it perfectly. I was in considerable trouble. I learned what it looked like when Luke was angry in month 3 because of me. I had gone to meet a friend for lunch and had not told Luke in advance. This was objectively a failure on my part. My schedule had changed and I'd been in my head about the logistics, and I'd simply walked out of the building without mentioning it and gotten halfway down the block before his call hit my phone. I answered. There was a pause. One beat. The kind of pause where someone is deciding, at speed, how to handle something. Where are you? It was not quite a question, I told him. I explained. I apologized because I was already aware I'd been careless. I'll be there in 4 minutes, he said and hung up. He was there in 3. He said nothing when he arrived. He didn't need to. The set of his body said it. The line of his shoulders, the jaw, the particular quality of stillness that was not calm but controlled. He stood at the edge of my eye line while I finished lunch with my friend, and when we left, he walked beside me back to the car, and the silence was a specific kind of silence, waited. In the car, before starting the engine, he sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. If your schedule changes, he said very evenly, you tell me. I know. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. Another pause. When he started the engine, his hands on the wheel were careful and exact, the way his hands always were when he was containing something. Something could have happened, he said, and there it was, underneath the professional framing. The piece that wasn't about protocol, the raw edge of it. The particular thinness in his voice that was not anger at a job complication, but something with more texture. Something personal. I looked at his profile. He was staring ahead at the road. Luke, I said. It's fine, he said. Just don't do it again. He drove. I watched the road. Something had shifted. Some layer of the professional surface had shown a seam, just for a moment, and I had seen through it, and what was on the other side was a man who had been genuinely frightened. Not for his career, for me. I turned that knowledge over for the rest of the day like a stone, looking at what was underneath it. In month 3, there was an incident. It was not dramatic in the way I might have imagined. No one burst through the door, no car chase, nothing that would have made a good scene in a film. It was quieter and more unsettling than that. I came home from a long evening event and found Luke in the front hallway with a quality of alertness that was different from his usual vigilance. More charged. He told me, without preamble, that there had been surveillance on the building. A vehicle parked outside twice in the same day, a detail his team had flagged. The assessment was elevated. Not emergency level, but elevated. He told me this standing in the hallway, and his voice was very even because Luke's voice was always very even, but his eyes were on my face with a focused intensity that was about something more than professional procedure. Are you all right? He asked at the end of his briefing. Yes. You're the one who's been dealing with this all day. That's my job. That doesn't mean you can't be tired. A pause. He looked at me with that expression I had begun to recognize as the one that meant I had said something that had landed in a place he hadn't expected. I'm fine, he said. All right, I said, and let it go. But later that night I was reading on the couch and looked up to find him at the window, not looking out but standing near it, one hand at his side and his face in the partial light with its particular line of watchful attention, and I thought he would put himself between anything and me without a second's calculation. Not because he was paid to. The paid to part was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Something in his posture said something older and more personal than that. I went back to my book. My heart was doing something ill-advised. The vehicle was determined to be unrelated. The alert went back down. Luke's posture the next morning was its ordinary contained self, but I had seen the window moment. I had filed it in the place where I was keeping all the things I was not yet ready to name. Let me tell you what I knew about myself by the end of month 3. I knew that I was 26 years old and had been in 2 relationships, both of them good-natured and ultimately insufficient, not because of anything wrong with the people involved, but because I had a persistent, inconvenient tendency to fall not for people who were easy but for people who were complicated in specific ways. People with depth they didn't always show. People whose kindness was not surface performance but something structural, embedded in how they moved through the world. I knew that I was, for reasons that made complete professional and personal sense, deeply attracted to Luke Leach. I knew that this was either the most obvious thing in the world or the most inadvisable, possibly both. I sat with it for a long time before I let myself look directly at it. There is a particular discipline in not looking at something true. You have to maintain it daily. You have to keep your eyes moving past it. Keep your hands busy. Keep the narrative of practicality running. He is my bodyguard. He is here because my father's lawyers sent him. He is professional. He is contained. He does not show what he feels about anything. Except, except I had seen him move closer at the gallery. Except I had heard his voice in the car after. The particular controlled precision of it when he said I noticed a change in the dynamic, as if he were narrating a document rather than a feeling. Except I had seen the 3-minute drive from headquarters when I'd given him a 4-minute window. Except I had heard the rawness in something could have happened and felt the weight of it. These were data points. I was a person who worked with data. The data was suggesting something. The question was whether I was brave enough to test the hypothesis, and whether testing it was fair, and whether any of this was remotely appropriate given the circumstances, and whether I could bear being wrong. I was almost certain I could not bear being wrong. I sat on my terrace with a cup of tea that I let go cold and looked at the city and thought about his hands and his silence and the way he listened, and I did not arrive at any resolution. Inside, I could hear the quiet sounds of Luke in the kitchen, moving carefully through space, being there. It rained for 3 days in the middle of month 4, the hard, persistent kind that turns a city gray and silver and drives people inside. On the second evening of rain, I came home to find Luke at the kitchen counter with a small collection of ingredients in front of him, and the smell of something warm in the air. "I cooked," he said without turning around. "If that's all right." It was more than all right. I put my bag down and came to stand near enough to see what he was making, and it turned out to be a soup, simple and careful and good smelling. And I stood there and watched him ladle it into bowls with the same precision he brought to everything, and I thought with sudden vertiginous clarity, I am in love with this man. Not falling, not approaching, there, already there, as if I'd arrived somewhere I didn't know I'd been walking toward. I sat down at the table. He brought the bowls. He sat across from me. We ate. The rain hit the windows. He told me unprompted something small, something he'd seen on his run that morning. A dog trying very determinedly to carry a stick that was too large for it, refusing to leave it behind, adjusting its grip and adjusting its grip until it managed. He told this story with the flat economy of someone who doesn't perform stories, and it was somehow one of the most charming things I'd ever heard. "That's very you," I said without thinking. He looked at me. "What do you mean?" I considered lying and then didn't. Refusing to leave something behind. Adjusting until it works. He held my gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression, too deep and too brief for me to name it. "Sure," he said quietly and looked back at his soup. The rain kept on. We ate the rest of the meal in a silence that was different from other silences. Fuller. Like a room with all the furniture moved into it. I learned by accident that Luke had been hurt badly before. It wasn't something he told me. It was something I pieced together over weeks from the way he held himself at certain edges. There were moments, rare but recognizable once I understood what I was seeing, when the control would shift slightly. When someone mentioned trust or permanence or the future, something in his expression would tighten. Not much, not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But I was watching closely. I was watching more closely than I had any professional justification for. I asked, one evening, carefully, how long he'd been in private security and whether he'd ever considered something else. He said that he'd considered other things before, that life had simplified the options. "What simplified them?" I asked. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. "Made some decisions wrong," he said at last. "Trusted some things that weren't as solid as I thought." A pause. "Good to be clear about what you're good at." He said this very evenly, the way he said most things. But I heard in it the faint resonance of a wound that had healed to a scar. The kind of scar that does not hurt anymore but changes how you move. I did not push. I filed it away. What it told me was that his containment was not personality alone. It was also protection. He had learned somewhere that openness could cost something he couldn't afford to replace. So he had built his walls with care, and he had lived inside them with a discipline that was almost admirable, except that I was increasingly certain, sitting across from him in this apartment that had become ours in practice, if not in name, that the walls were expensive to maintain and that he was paying the price quietly and without complaint. I wanted to put my hand on the table between us and wait to see if he would take it. I wanted this so clearly it was almost painful, not for my sake, but for his. I didn't do it. The moment passed. He refilled my water glass precisely without being asked, and I watched his hands and thought about all the things those hands did for me daily: the coffee, the doors, the adjusted lamps that carried groceries, the 3-minute drive from a 4-minute window. 3 jobs, I thought. One job is keeping me safe. The second job is caring for everything around me. The third job is the one he won't name. The almost happened on the Thursday evening. We'd had a long week. I'd been dealing with a difficult funding situation at work. Late nights and early mornings and too much screen and not enough sleep. Luke had been dealing with a stepped-up security assessment, which meant more vigilance and less rest on his part too, though he wouldn't have named it that way. We were on the couch. I was reading. He was reading. This was by this point an entirely normal way for us to spend evenings, the two of us in the same space, each occupied, no requirement for conversation. Just the easy shared quiet that I had come to depend on more than I could honestly justify. At some point I shifted position, and my shoulder ended up against his, and neither of us moved away. We stayed that way for a long time, reading, shoulder to shoulder. The room was warm, and the lamp made a gold circle, and outside the city was the city, and in here, it was us. I read the same paragraph 4 times. My heartbeat, which had been doing something measured and regular for 26 years, was now apparently attempting a new rhythm it hadn't cleared with anyone. After a while, I looked up from my book, which I was definitely not reading, and turned my head, and he was already looking at me. We were very close. The space between our faces was small and warm and full of things that didn't have words yet. His expression, for once, was not fully composed. Something had come up to the surface of it through the careful architecture of his control, something I would have called afraid in any other context, except that it was also something else. Something wanting. Something that had been restrained for a long time. "Luke," I said. His jaw worked slightly. He looked at my mouth and then back at my eyes, and something in his expression closed almost, and he said very quietly, "Sean, just my name, nothing else." But the way he said it, as if he'd been saying it in a room inside himself for a long time, and this was the first time it had been allowed out. My hand moved the hand that was not holding the book, and it landed on his forearm, just my fingertips, and I felt his whole body go very still, not pulling away, not moving toward, just still, the way things are still when they're deciding. Then his phone buzzed. The sound was an intrusion so perfectly timed for maximum cruelty that I would have laughed about it later in retrospect. His security check-in. He looked at it, and the check-in required a response, and by the time he'd responded, the moment had changed shape. He put his phone down. I moved my hand back. He picked up his book. I stared at the page. Neither of us said a word, but the room was different. Something had been named by the almost of it, by the almost that was not quite nothing and not quite something. The word Sean in his voice. The stillness of his body under my fingers. These things had happened and could not unhappen. And now we both knew that the other one knew. I did not sleep well that night. I suspected he didn't either. The next day was careful. Luke made the coffee. I came out and poured a cup. The kitchen felt like a room after a storm. The air altered, the light slightly different. Nothing physically had changed. Everything had changed. I said good morning. He said good morning. We were, by any external measure, exactly as we had been yesterday morning. Except that we weren't. He drove me to work and we didn't talk in the car, but it was a different kind of not talking. A more conscious kind. A kind that was aware of itself. I sat in my office and did very little useful work and thought about the specific way he had said my name. I'd had people say my name in various ways over the course of my life, with affection, with frustration, with the particular carelessness of people who are not really paying attention. But his way had been none of those things. His way had been the way you say something you have been thinking about for a long time, something you have turned over in private until it has a particular worn quality, smooth with handling. I told my coworker that I had a headache and went into the small side room where we kept supplies and stood there for a minute. What I needed to decide was whether I was going to name this or let it continue as unspoken architecture. This third thing between us, this undeclared weight. The arguments for silence were not nothing. He was here professionally. Naming it changed everything. He might not feel what I thought he felt. He might feel it and feel it was wrong. He might feel it and not know how to handle it, given his history with trust, and me pushing could push him somewhere he couldn't come back from. The situation was inherently complicated by power and employment, even if neither of us had created it. The arguments for speaking were simpler. Every small act of care he had given me. The way he said my name, the coffee, the adjusted lamp, the blackout curtains, the 3-minute drive. The way he had been absolutely still under my fingers, choosing to stay. The way his expression had been, for one rare unguarded moment, full of something that had been waiting a long time for permission. I went back to my desk. I did not resolve it that day, but I resolved that I was going to soon. I want to tell you about the things Luke did not say, because they are as important as anything he did. He did not say, I think about you differently than I should. He did not say, I've been awake longer than I need to be some nights because this apartment feels like something I don't want to stop being inside. He did not say, when that man at the gallery touched your arm, I had to decide, very deliberately, not to move in a way that had nothing to do with security protocols. He did not say, I have been careful my whole life since the last time I wasn't careful, and careful has kept me safe. But it has also kept me from things I didn't know I wanted until there was a specific person I wanted them with. He did not say, I think about the weight of your shoulder against mine every single day. He did not say, I am a man who has spent years being excellent at his job, and I have never before had a job that required me to be near someone I love and pretend I wasn't doing a third job. He did not say any of these things. Instead, he made coffee. He ran 3 steps behind my pace. He moved closer at galleries. He kept his walls up with the practiced discipline of someone who has learned what happens when they come down. He said my name once, in a low voice, in a lamplight room, and then picked his book back up. This was Luke Leach's way of loving someone, quietly, completely at a distance of exactly 3 steps. And I was done with exactly 3 steps. It was a Sunday. The farmer's market. We had done this enough times that we had a route we took without discussing it. Produce first, then the coffee cart at the far end, then a slow loop back. At the coffee cart, waiting for our cups, I said, I need to talk to you. He looked at me. All right, not here, when we get back. A pause. Something moved behind his eyes, a flash of the controlled worry of someone who has learned that conversations that begin with, I need to talk to you often carry weight. All right, he said again. We walked back. The bag was full and he carried it. We didn't talk, but it was a focused kind of silence now, like walking towards something. In the apartment, he put the bag on the counter. I put my coffee on the table. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him across the space and thought, just say it. You have never been a person who can't say the difficult thing. Say it. I know this is complicated, I said. I know there are about 12 reasons why this is professionally inadvisable, and I'm not going to pretend those don't exist. He was very still, his hands at his sides, watching me. But I'd been paying attention, Luke, to everything. The coffee and the lamp and the curtains and how fast you drove when you thought something might have happened to me. And the gallery. And the couch. I paused. And the way you said my name. A long silence. The Sunday street sounds came in faintly through the window. I might be wrong, I said quietly. And if I am, I would like you to tell me, and we will return to exactly how we've been, and I will not mention this again. But I don't think I'm wrong. Luke looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked down at his hands, briefly, the way he did when he was deciding how to spend words. You're not wrong, he said. The simplicity of it. 3 words, contained and exact, the way he said everything. I let out a breath. Okay, I said. It doesn't change what I'm here to do, he said, and his voice had a careful quality, not defensive but honest. You need to know that. Whatever this is, I don't stop doing my job. I know that. I wouldn't ask you to. He looked at me again, and this time there was something in his face I hadn't seen before, or maybe had seen only in fragments. Open was the word for it. The door ajar instead of sealed. I don't know how to do this the normal way, he said. He said this very quietly, as if telling me something true was a physical effort, which I thought it probably was for him. I've been careful for a long time. I know. I don't want to do this wrong. Luke. I took 2 steps forward. which brought me close enough that the geometry between us had changed entirely. I looked up at him. You have been doing the third job for months without naming it. You've been doing it perfectly. You are not going to do this wrong. The line between his brows appeared, the tired one, the unguarded one. The third job, he repeated. The coffee, the lamp, the curtains. 3 steps exactly every single run. I watched his face. The way you stayed still when I touched your arm. Something shifted in him. Not a collapse. Nothing in Luke Leach collapsed, but a settling. A tension releasing that had been held so long it had become invisible from the outside but must have been enormous from the inside. He raised his hand slowly with the particular care of someone who has spent a long time choosing what to do with their hands, and he put it against my jaw and held my face with a gentleness so complete that it was like being told something in a language I hadn't known he spoke. Sean, he said. My name again, in that voice, in that way. Yeah, I said, because there was nothing else to say. He kissed me, not urgently, not with the momentum of long suppression, but carefully. The way he did everything. The way you handle something you've been afraid of losing before you even had it. His mouth was warm and steady and certain, and his hand held my face with the same precision he gave everything, and I thought distantly, like a thought from very far away. Oh, of course, obviously. When we stopped, he stayed close, his forehead almost touching mine. I should have said it before, he said quietly. You were saying it the whole time. A pause. Then, very low, I know. I just couldn't say it. You can now. I felt him breathe. I can now, he agreed. What changed was everything, and also nothing. He still made the coffee. He still drove 3 steps behind me. He still made his bed with the same military precision, still kept his nightstand objects arranged exactly so, still went to bed late and woke before me. His professional self did not dissolve or loosen. He was still the same man who had walked into my doorway 4 months ago and assessed my windows with the focus of someone who takes protection seriously. But there were new things, not dramatic new things, quiet ones which suited us both. He touched me more, not constantly, not performatively, but with the particular intention of someone who has decided that something is allowed and is learning its shape. His hand at the small of my back when we moved through a crowd, his shoulder against mine in the evening. The casual brush of his fingers when he handed me my coffee, not incidental, chosen. He talked more. Not a flood, he would never be a flood, but more. He told me about the watch on his nightstand. It had been his grandfather's. He told me about the stone. He picked it up from a riverbed years ago during a period he described as difficult, and it had become a kind of habit object, the thing his hand found when he needed to feel steady. He told me about the books he turned face down. They were always ones he was embarrassed by how much he liked, which was the most Luke Leach thing I had ever heard. I told him things too, things I hadn't said to many people, about the distance with my father that had existed my whole life, the way being the second son had felt like being in a room adjacent to where things happened, about the nonprofit and what it actually meant to me, not the version I performed for donors but the real version, the one that was still about a specific teacher who'd believed in me when I was 11, about the 2 relationships that had been good and insufficient and what they'd taught me. He listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, and occasionally he said something that was short and precise and landed exactly where it needed to land. The couch in the evenings was different now. Closer. Sometimes his hand rested on my knee, and I would put my hand over his without looking up from whatever I was reading, and we would stay that way. There was one evening when I fell asleep on the couch, which was not a thing I had ever done before because I had always gone to bed properly. But it had been an exceptionally long week, and the warmth of the apartment and the comfortable weight of his presence beside me had conspired against my intentions. When I woke, it was later, the lamp was still on, and there was a blanket over me that had not been there before. A blanket from the hall closet because I recognized the pattern. He had gotten it without waking me and put it over me with the same care he put into everything. He was still on the couch, his book in his hand, awake. I looked at him for a moment in the particular softness of just awake, before any of the day's architecture reassembled itself, and what I felt looking at him was so uncomplicated and so large that it was almost frightening. He looked up and found me looking. "You are cold," he said simply. "Thank you," I said. He nodded and looked back at his book. I pulled the blanket closer and stayed there a while longer because there was nowhere I wanted to be more than exactly there, and because I was learning slowly that he did not require me to be anywhere other than where I was. These were the large things, structured as small things. This was how Luke showed love, consistently, exactly, without announcement. One evening, a month after Sunday, he put the stone in my hand. We were on the terrace, the dead succulent still in its pot because I kept forgetting to replace it, and now somehow it had become sentimental, and the city was lit up below us. And he placed the smooth, dark stone in my palm without preamble. I looked at it. Then at him. "I don't need it anymore," he said. Quietly, with that Luke economy, saying the large thing in the fewest possible words. I held it. It was exactly the right weight for a hand. Smooth from long handling. "What did you need it for?" I asked, even though I thought I knew. "Something to hold on to," he said. "When I needed to feel like things had a shape." He looked out at the city. His profile was clean and steady in the light. "I have something to hold on to now," he said. I closed my fingers around the stone. "You know," I said after a moment, "the dead succulent has been here for 4 months and you've never once replaced it." A long pause. "I was waiting for you to," he said. "I was waiting for you to." We looked at each other and something opened in his face. Something that had been working its way up through all that careful architecture for a long time. And it was the particular warmth of a man who has been alone inside himself for years and has decided finally that he does not have to be. He almost smiled. For Luke Leach, that was everything. Later, inside, we sat at the kitchen table with the last of the evening's tea, and he said very quietly something he had not said before. I thought I had stopped wanting this. I waited, knowing that the space after that sentence needed to be held open. This. He looked at the table. The watch was on the other side of the apartment in his room, but his hands were on the table and I could see the familiar tension in them, the choosing. Somewhere permanent, something I wasn't going to be moved away from. "Who moved you away before?" I asked. A long pause. "My own choices, mostly," he said. The work made it easier to believe the distance was necessary, that the work was the thing and everything else was secondary. He paused again. "It isn't as hard to believe that when no one is arguing with it. And now?" He looked at me with those deep water eyes. "Now I have someone arguing with it," he said. It wasn't a declaration in any formal sense. It was Luke's version of one, which was smaller in form and larger in content. I had learned to receive things in the size they were offered, not to demand they come in any particular package. "Good," I said. "I'll keep arguing." He picked up his teacup and held it with both hands the way he always did for the warmth. "I know you will," he said, and there was something in it that sounded almost like relief. "People ask, sometimes, what it's like, the two of us. It is a reasonable question, a bodyguard in his principle. Complicated history, complicated structure. The whole thing a series of overlapping professional and personal lines. Here is what I tell them. When I bother to explain it, he had one job, keep me safe. He did a second job, care for the space around me, the small daily things that add up to a life. He did a third job, the one nobody assigned him, the one he did in silence for months, in every cup of coffee and every adjusted lamp and every precise 3 steps and every careful stillness, under a touch he had not expected and could not afford to want. He loved me without saying it until he could. That third job, I think, was the one that cost him the most, not because it was hard, but because he built a life on the premise that the third job was not available to him anymore, that the particular vulnerability of it was something he could no longer sustain, and he had done it anyway. Without intending to, without being able to stop himself, because something about the specific combination of who I am and who he is had made the walls expensive and the alternative more appealing than he'd budgeted for. I think about that sometimes, about the way love accumulates before it announces itself. The way it lives in small acts and sustained attention long before it ever becomes a word or a name or a handheld in lamplight. The way Luke Leach had been building something for months, without a plan for what to do with it, carrying it in the same careful hands that carried everything, waiting without knowing he was waiting for the moment he could set it down. He still makes the coffee. Every morning, before I wake. I've told him he doesn't have to. He makes it anyway. I've stopped mentioning it. There are 3 jobs. He does all of them. This is, I have come to understand, simply who he is. A man who, once he decides something is worth protecting, does not do it halfway. He does not do it with fanfare. He does not do it with declarations. Though he has learned slowly that I need to hear the words sometimes, and he gives them to me when I do in that low, careful voice, as if each one is weighed before it's offered. He does it completely and quietly, and every single day. Last week, I finally replaced the dead succulent. Luke stood in the doorway of the terrace and watched me put the new one in the pot, and after a moment he came and crouched beside me and repositioned it so it caught the light better, and then stood up and went back inside. He said nothing. He didn't need to. I put my hand in my pocket and found the stone, smooth and river-worn and exactly the right weight. Something to hold on to, something with a shape. I stayed on the terrace a while longer, and inside I could hear the quiet sounds of him moving through our apartment. 3 jobs, all of them, steady and certain as weather. I was not afraid of the storm anymore. I had learned that it was the kind that stays. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even 1 member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.